two questions. How many Muslims are there estimated to be in the world? Let's crowdsource this. A billion? 1.8 billion? 2 billion. 2 billion? Okay. So all of these things are estimated to be. I'm getting figures estimated between 1.3 and 1.6 billion. So we're in the ballpark, which is terrific. Are there more Muslims or Christians? So how many Christians are there in the world? Are there more Muslims? Who thinks there are more Muslims than Christians? Okay. Who thinks there are more Christians than Muslims? There are still more Christians than Muslims. There are 2.2 billion Christians compared with the 1.3 to 1.6 billion Muslims. However, by 2050, it is projected that there will be more Muslims in the world. Which single country has the largest Muslim population? Indonesia. Anyone else? Okay. How many Muslims are there estimated to live in Indonesia? 100 million?
Less than 1.6 billion.
Estimated 208 million Muslims just in Indonesia. No, I guess we don't need the writing. What percentage of, now, often when we think of Muslim, we think of Arab. That Arabs are Muslims and Muslims are Arabs. What percentage of Muslims are estimated to, what percentage of Arabs, no, excuse me, what percentage of Muslims, what part of the Muslim world is Arab?
A third.
A third. Any other guesses? Who says a quarter? A quarter is more likely to be correct. That although Arabic is the language of Muslim practice and the Quran, only 25% of the world's Muslims are Arab. So 75% of the world's Muslims are not Arab. What percentage of the world's Muslims are estimated to live in Europe? Which is turned topsy-turvy by the Muslim issue, that all the Muslims flowing in. What percentage of Muslims live in Europe? 2%? 1%? 5%? We are again pretty close. It's estimated to be 3%. What percentage live in the Americas, North and South America combined? 1%? 5%? 3%? 0.3%. 0.3% of the world's Muslims live in the Americas. How many Muslims are estimated to live in the United States of America? 3 million. Okay. Other estimates? We're now getting to the point where the surveys say we don't know. A, it is not a question that is asked on the census. And B, the Muslim population has really, there was very little Muslim population in the United States until the 1950s, and it has been very rapidly growing to the point where the figures change every year. So we get estimates of about 3 million. You see some estimates as low as 2 million. You see some estimates as high as 5 million. How many Jews live in the United States? It's estimated 5.5 to 6.5 million. So there are still more Jews than Muslims, but the order of magnitude is similar. And I would say that given the trend with birth rates and with immigration, that we will soon have exactly the same number of Muslims and Jews, and then we will have more Muslims than Jews, because the Jewish population is really not growing. So where does there are about 160 countries in the world. Where does the United States rank in terms of Muslim population? Are we first? Are we 100th? Are we? Let's get a guess here. 140. We're actually about 55th in terms of there are 54 countries in the world that have more Muslims than the United States. What percentage of the Muslims living in the United States right now? What percentage were born in the United States? 2% only. They're all immigrants. Only 2% were born in the United States.
50%.
Wait. 40% were born in the United States. 50% were born in the States?
75.
75% were born in the United States. Okay.
Bingo.
And, I'm sorry, your name is? Yes. Betsy. What was your estimate?
40%.
Okay, 34% U.S. born, 66%.
Who's?
66% of the Muslims in the United States are immigrants. And then of those 34% were U.S. born, 75% were born into Islam, and 25% converted, and most of the converts are African American. Yes. How many Muslims are estimated to live in the 5 boroughs of New York City? Most of them. Okay, give me a number of how many Muslims are estimated to live in New York City. No, a population number, not a percentage.
1 million.
1 million, 800,000, 2 million, half a million.
100,000.
The estimates are between 400,000 and 800,000. It's very interesting to follow these complicated arguments. How do you find out how many it is? Do you find out, some people look at how many go to services at a mosque, and then they say only for Eid, which is their high holidays, and then they say, well, but only a third report that they go to an Eid service, so let's triple that. Others look at other ways to do it, but you get between 400,000 and 800,000. And my final question is, how many mosques are there estimated to be in New York City? 150?
250.
250? I read there was a series that went on. They went and they looked for every mosque. And I put a mosque in air quotes because it's those of us who have gone to Islamic prayer spaces, particularly past NYU, a mosque can be a garage in the West 30s. It can be a space in a very nondescript commercial building down in the financial district. It is, in Manhattan, the only building that looks mosque-like with a dome and minarets is on 96th and 3rd. But they found 285 prayer spaces in New York City. So, crowdsourcing, who wins the green kippah? Who feels they had the most? I'm thinking Betsy wins the green kippah. Would we agree that Betsy did a good job? So, having gone over this and piqued your curiosity, I hope, we have here somewhere my handouts. Oh, they're right here. Which I will go over briefly and allow you to study in more depth. If we can distribute some on this side. There may not be enough, so I would ask you to share. I can certainly email some if we need to. So pass around so that there's one for every 2 or 3 people sitting together. And could I have one so that I can read through it? So what we have here, I just need one. So what we have here is a run through these numbers. I didn't source them, and they came from a lot of different places, but basically the first thing is Muslims in the world. We see our 1.6 billion Muslims versus our how many Jews? It's 2 pages. 14 million Jews. And then I go through the areas of the world. The largest in terms of a third of the Muslims live in South Asia, Middle East, North Africa. Middle East, North Africa is where the majority of the Arab Muslims live. And then you can see the top 10 countries here make up over 1.1 billion Muslims. So these top 10 countries account for 70% of the world's Muslims. If you flip to page 2, we look at the European countries. France with 5 million probably has the largest percentage of Muslims in their population, 7%. Germany and UK 5, US 1, Italy 4, Spain 4, and Canada 2. So these are the countries that are saying we're being overrun by Muslims, none of which have more than 5% Muslims in their population. Palestinian territories, 97%. Israel, what percent? 17%, very good. And then in Muslims in the United States, let's look at that 3.3 billion Muslim figure. Born outside was 65%. Middle East, North African, which would be the Arabs, 16%, South Asia, 16%, Pakistan, 15%, Sub-Saharan Africa, 7%, Iran, 2%, and other unknown, 10%. And of the US-born, half are African-American and half are other races or ethnicities. Now, this was one of the things that immediately became apparent to me as I did my mosque work, that it was not a lot of Arabs streaming into the mosque. Particularly on 55th Street, where sort of people from the local businesses, I just could not believe the differing backgrounds of all of the people who were going to that mosque. I had an imam from the mosque downtown tell us that he felt that there were people who would come through his doors from over 100 different countries.
Wow.
Where our population is really relatively homogeneous, theirs is extremely heterogeneous. On the next page, I won't go through this in great detail, you can go through it on your own. We have the estimated Muslim populations in all of the states that have at least 25,000 Muslims. At the point, this study has Texas over New York. I think they're sort of back and forth. I wouldn't be surprised if New York was now leading. New York is certainly the largest Muslim population in terms of metropolitan statistical areas. And then 800,000 to 400,000, 800,000 Muslims in New York, 285 mosques, the most in Brooklyn, then Queens, then Bronx, then Manhattan, and then Staten Island.
Interesting, Minnesota's not in the States.
It's, you know, I'm going to be, in the next email that goes out, and I hope that everyone here is getting House of Peace emails, I will be sourcing a lot of this, and there will be links so that you can look at these studies in more detail yourself. I will leave it up to you to read that What Do American Muslims Believe? It's very interesting. This is from the Pew study, and the difference between Shiite and Sunni Muslims. And then just a brief word about the history of the Muslims in the United States. It is estimated, it is believed, it is thought that up to half of the black slaves who were brought to North America from Africa came from countries where Islam was the predominant religion at the time.
Exactly.
They were, thank you. I counted that very carefully. They were certainly not supported in their practice of Islam once they reached North America. But there are fragments of jewelry in burials, there are tombs, there are a lot of different evidence that they came from Muslim countries.
It's a little mixed in the sense that I think the Muslims were also slavers. So it's a mixed history.
You are absolutely right. That is probably correct. But that is, so when we talk about Islam in the United States, we need to understand that the African Americans, the black experience in the United States probably comes with a lot of Muslim heritage to it. Small-scale immigration began in the 1840s with the American arrival of Yemenis and Turks. Muslim communities included Dearborn, which is still a very large Muslim community, in Quincy, Massachusetts, Ross, North Dakota, Chicago, and New York. There were no mosques in the United States until the early 1990s. The first was either in Biddeford, Maine, or Ross, North Dakota. The first building specifically built to be a mosque was in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, in 1934. In 1952, there were only 20 mosques in the United States. The majority of mosques in the United States were founded in the past 30 years or so. And again, when I say mosque, this is not a big building with a dome and minarets, although there are now mosques in a number of places, including in Dearborn, where there is one which fits 3,000 people. But the same is true when you talk about the history of synagogues in the United States. The Shir of Israel says we were founded in 1654. Founded is a loose term. There were a minion which seems to have met in the second floor above a mill on Mill Street, which also seems to be where Marble Collegiate met. So they were sort of sharing the space with Marble Collegiate, where the Collegiate Church would be there on Sundays and Shir of Israel would be there on Saturdays. The first large migration from Muslim lands came between 1875 and 1912 from the rural areas of Greater Syria, which is Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, and Lebanon of the Ottoman Empire. What happens is, when there is disruption, when there is famine, when there is something that goes on in a part of the world, that is when you see immigrants coming to the United States. Today, on St. Patrick's Day, we celebrate the arrival of the Irish, who did not come because they thought this was a nice place to live. They came because they were starving in Ireland. The first recorded mosque in New York City was founded in 1893, although it was a white American convert who founded this for people, white Americans who wanted to explore this exotic religion. In 1931, New York got its first building fully dedicated to being an Islamic mosque. In 1939, a significant Orthodox Sunni Muslim mosque was established in Brooklyn Heights. After World War II, there were a small number of Muslims entering the United States, and the mosque on Upper Manhattan at Riverside Drive in 72nd, which is still there, was founded for Muslims from India, Pakistan, and other Muslim countries. The 1960s, as recently as the 1960s, were pivotal years for Islam in America. The 1965 Immigration Act made it much easier for immigrants from countries with large Muslim populations to come to America. New York City in particular saw a rising tide of Muslim American immigrants, and the visible presence of African American Muslims made this seem a place that was welcoming to Muslims. The rising tide of Muslim immigrants spiked upwards during periods of turmoil in the Muslim world. In 1967, the Arab loss of the Arab-Israeli War spurred Palestinians into New York City. Civil war in Pakistan, East Pakistan breakaway to form Bangladesh, the wars in the Balkans, and civil strife in Africa all led to new waves of Muslim immigration. I am going to, in 1979, the Iranian Revolution forced many Persians into exile who came here, and also to Los Angeles. There's a huge Persian population in Los Angeles.
They still call it Tehran.
To Angeles. And then in the 1990s, there was an increasing wave of African Muslim immigrants. Black Muslims, I read through a lot of this. It is a complicated history, which starts in the establishment of the Nation of Islam in 1930 by Wallace Fard Muhammad, taken over by Elijah Muhammad in 1930. This was, I don't want to characterize it too much because I'm not an expert. It was a religion based on concepts of Islam. It was a non-Christian religion, which harked back to the Muslim origins or the non-Christian origins of many African Americans. To me, it seems to have a similar type of relationship to Orthodox Islam as Mormonism does to Orthodox Christianity. It is based on, it has elements of, but it's quite different. And then there's a complicated history where in the past 20 years or so, many of the African American Muslims who were practicing that strain of Muslim went over to a more Orthodox Muslim. So most African American Muslims are now practicing a much more Orthodox form of Islam. I will stop there, and I will turn it over. Well, I will now do a little dialogue with Rabbi Marisa, unless there's any pressing questions about what I've discussed or the handout. Yes?
You mentioned the diversity in the mosques.
Yes.
But it's minimal. Yeah.
That is one of the things we will be discussing.
Okay.
Okay. That is a question we're going to put on hold for just a minute. Other questions? Okay. Yes?
If you went from mosque to mosque
Yes.
in Newark and Dearborn,
Right.
would the service be the same?
Very interesting. The liturgy is the same, and the services are almost always conducted in Arabic, which a quarter or a third of the population understands is the language they speak, and to more than half of the worshipers in the mosque, it is a language that they have learned for worship, which they don't necessarily know otherwise. Does that sound familiar to anybody? And this is a good segue. I'm going to ask Marisa, when you and I had lunch before you even became co-chair, you said to me, and it was very interesting, here are the similarities between Jew and Muslim, which make us soul religions. And can you go through what you felt those were?
Yes, I'm trying to remember what I said in that conversation now. So first of all, I'll say that there are ways in which we have a lot of parallels, both with Jews in America and Muslims in America, and then much more broadly, the ways that Judaism and Islam we're basically cousins. Right? The religions come from Semitic backgrounds. We both pray in a Semitic language, if you hear Islamic prayer, or if you go to the mosque with us on Fridays and you are invited upstairs to join the prayer and to listen to the prayer, there's a lot that you'll hear if you're familiar with the Hebrew prayers that sounds very, very familiar. We have, depending on who you ask, 70 names for God, more or less, all these different names for God, the one who is merciful, the one who, the healer of all flesh. And in Islam, there are 99 names of God, many of which are actually the same. I'm actually hoping at some point later in the spring and the summer to do a text study together. They're the same as the Hebrew names. They translate to the same concepts. And in some cases, the Hebrew and the Arabic are so close that it's very easy to kind of look at them and be like, wait a minute, isn't this my religion? It's really, there's a lot of very, very parallel language. Now, I will say that one way in which things are very different is that Islam is the most diverse religious group in the United States. Nationally, ethnically, racially, linguistically, it is the most diverse group in the United States. There was a time when Jews were also quite diverse, and at around the time when my great-grandparents were arriving about 100 years ago, we shifted into being very predominantly Ashkenazi. But at that same time, 100 years ago, we're talking about where mosques are, and that these prayer spaces are not necessarily formal prayer buildings. 100 years ago, when my great-grandfather was working in the fashion district, in the garment district, the prayer spaces were also, you know, you did mincha at the back of the room in between cutting stuff on a Tuesday afternoon when you happened to get enough guys together. There's a way in which that is also very, very parallel, that is happening as well.
There were a number of social parallels that you mentioned to me, one being that we were a minority religion in a Christian world.
Very much so, yes. If you have not heard the phrase, Christian hegemony. In the same way that Jewish kids grow up in the United States, knowing the words to Christmas carols, knowing that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, being aware of having a different name that other people don't totally understand what that is, of maybe having a different schedule of holidays and days that you miss school that other people don't understand, and maybe think, wow, why do they get to miss school on that day when I don't? New York City, not anymore. In the same way that we're used to having, or at least dealing with other people's dietary needs in our community, of being on a different schedule entirely, and that there's a lunar calendar that actually affects what we do with our lives. There are a lot of these things that for Muslims in America, it's exactly the same conversations. I will say that when I was first getting into teaching some of this stuff, and I was asking Muslim friends and colleagues, what should I be reading? One of the things that they turned me on to was Muslim mom blogs. Mom blogs.
Not imam.
People, mothers, writing their blogs. It's like the same, there's people writing their blogs about all different kinds of topics. And the number, if you just Google the December dilemma, right? You've heard the phrase, the December dilemma. It's usually, we think of it as like, this is what happens when the kids in your lives are like, well, why can't we have a Christmas tree? And it's not fair. Half the blogs that you read, half the articles that you read about the December dilemma are written by Jewish parents, and half of them are written by Muslim parents. So there's a lot of ways in which, and also, the idea that you're going to, for kids who are going to religious school, that they're learning to pray in a different language, that they don't necessarily know what the words mean. They kind of are supposed to be learning them, but, I was the kid who actually eventually learned to enjoy Hebrew school, and I still did not really learn what all the words meant until I started rabbinical school. So there's a lot of ways in which Muslim experiences in America, both regardless of first generation, third generation, 12th generation, and Jewish experiences in America, have a lot.
Disregard that noise behind us.
God is letting me know that I'm forgetting
So,
something.
am I correct though that we have a lunar calendar, but it corrects itself so that the Jewish holidays can be early, they can be late, but the high holidays are going to be sometime between the beginning of September and the end of October. But the Muslim calendar does not, and so the holidays sort of is it a 30? What's the cycle? They travel through the calendar.
So, because the Jewish holidays, many of the Jewish holidays are actually agriculturally based, the rabbis came up with this very complex system of putting in a month, so that even though the holidays would kind of shift around, every now and then they'd get a shove backwards, to keep them approximately in the same season, to make sure that we're not celebrating Tu B'Shvat at a time when, well, I mean, in this hemisphere, the trees are all in fact kind of bare, but in the place where the holiday began, that's when everything's blooming and it's gorgeous. The Muslim holidays are not agriculturally based in the same way. They have to do with commemorating events, Abraham, Jacob, Isaac. They're actually, a lot of them still, all those stories are incredibly familiar. They're still in the Quran, in many cases told very differently. It's really interesting to look at how some of these stories are told differently when we see them in the Torah and when they see them in the Quran. But they're based on where these stories happen. And so they go entirely on a lunar calendar with no correction for the solar year, which means that they just keep drifting earlier and earlier and earlier around the calendar, which means that the holy month of Ramadan, for example, for a full lunar month, every day from sunrise until sunset, there is a fast. Now, I will say that just as when you ask Jews, if you met a random Jew on the street, you said, so do you fast on Yom Kippur? In my experience as a rabbi, when I say that I'm a rabbi to people, about half the Jews I meet get a sheepish look on their face and they say, oh, I'm a really bad Jew. In the same way, I have a couple of times met Muslims, and when I say that I'm a rabbi, they say, oh, I'm a really bad Muslim. Okay, you really don't have to tell me that. No one does it. You really don't. People do different creative ways of observing or not observing. Some people are very, very strict. Some people only observe the fast for Ramadan and never step foot into a mosque the rest of the year.
Something like another holiday we have that involves food?
Something like that, exactly. And I will say that I had a classmate, I took a class when I was living in Jerusalem that was spiritual counseling in times of conflict. It was primarily for Israeli and Palestinian teachers, spiritual counselors, clergy. There isn't really a long tradition of pastoral counseling in the Middle East, and it's something that's just beginning. And so they ran this course. Two organizations that I'm connected with ran this course for Israelis and Palestinians who are in positions where they could be doing some real like spiritual pastoral counseling. And I was in this course, and it was in the summer, and it was right before Ramadan began that year. And one of my Muslim classmates and I were having lunch together one day, and I said to her, I asked her, do you fast for Ramadan? And she said, I mean, yeah, like I'm totally secular, but if I didn't, like my family, it would be really embarrassing, and I still live with my mom, so I kind of, you know, and sometimes I try to sneak something in the afternoon in my room, but mostly I fast. And I just said to her, you know, I'm really fascinated because I cannot imagine what it would be like to, I mean, people really get up at like 4:30 in the morning to have their first cup of coffee before sunrise when the fast begins, and then everybody gathers in the evening for a festive breaking of the fast.
Which is called?
Which is called iftar. It's a really fun thing to get invited to, or to host.
Or to host.
Put that out there as well. And she said, I can't imagine fasting every single day. I don't understand how you would do that. And she said, but you have this Yom Kippur, like you fast for an entire day, like overnight also, right? How do you, like that's easy. How do you do that? So it was another moment of
But I think one of the other things you were going to say was that given the seasons, in summer, the Ramadan fast may last from 4 o'clock in the morning until 11 o'clock at night. In the winter, it can last from 9 o'clock in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
I read a blog a couple of years ago about Muslims in Alaska in July.
Yeah.
It wasn't
really sucks.
Right. We do.
Exactly.
Let's move on to another question. The question about...
They would say so too.
They would say so too. The question
I think
about...
they were given some sort of dispensation.
Yeah, I don't know what do you do if you're a Muslim explorer in the Arctic Circle.
Well, I will tell
That
you,
just seems
I was on a plane coming back from Los Angeles that was full of Orthodox Jews. And I said, are we going to be doing mincha? They said yes. I said, at what time? The time in Los Angeles, the time in New York. He said, well, you know, there's been a rabbinic decision about that. I said, what? He said, there was an Israeli astronaut who couldn't figure out what time he was supposed to say his or her prayers. And they said, if you start your journey in a city that is your home city, that's where that's the time used. So the Israeli astronaut said prayers based on Jerusalem time, no matter where they were in terms of their day. Women in Islam, on the one hand,
there are a lot of them.
What is that? It's half of them. That means there are over 500 million women in Islam. Either they are downtrodden, they are forced to cover themselves, they are not able to serve as clergy, they either are not welcome in the mosque, or more often are behind a mechitza type separation or in a separate floor. But on the other hand, the two highest profile Muslim community leaders in the United States are women. Dr. Debbie Al-Montazar, who has been in and out of CBST, and Linda Sarsour, who was one of the organizers of the March on Washington. And I hear from Muslim friends, well, no, the women are the force behind organizing the community. Is it both? Is it one? Is it the other? And how is the status of women in American Islam versus the status of women in more traditional countries? Just a tiny little question.
It's a small question. So first of all, when Islam began, the foundation of the religion, right, it was founded at a time where, and in a place where, there was still this intensely tribal, intensely patriarchal culture. And one of the things that Islam actually brought, which was much more progressive than either Judaism or Christianity, was things like property rights for women. Islam was one of the first major systems of thought, I'll put it that way, as opposed to like religion or country or whatever, but one of the first major systems of thought that actually gave women the ability to own property in their own name. In Islamic law, when a woman gets married, and this is now going back to Muhammad, this goes back to the original set of laws and texts, a woman's dowry is given to her, not to her husband. It does not revert to her family, it's really hers. She then can use it to build her own business, the profits of which belong to her. And then she can decide, and has the authority to decide, how much of that money is going to be contributed to household expenses or not. So in that way, it's incredibly forward-thinking. Also, women were really encouraged to be, and this is partially going back to the story of Muhammad himself, whose wife, Khadija, was a very successful businesswoman. And he consulted with her regularly. And so women were actually also considered as sources of wisdom in a real way. It did not mean that women were becoming prayer leaders, as you say, and that's still mostly the case. There's the beginnings of people who are starting to say, wait a minute, is this something that we can change? But there's, within the religion itself, embedded within the religion itself, is actually a lot of freedom for women to write and create religious law, to make religious rulings. It's both an ancient and a modern phenomenon. But in the medieval period in Islam, there actually were women who served as Islamic judges, mostly having to do with family law, but there were women serving as judges and who were respected in the community in that way. It was mostly because of European influence coming into the Middle East that actually stopped that from happening. Where all of a sudden it was like, oh wait, no, women should not be in those positions of power. The Victorian influence was actually incredibly strong. But in the last, I'm going to say the last 20 years or so, more and more, and now this is in lots of countries, this is not just in countries where we think, oh, immigrant populations and then the younger people become more liberal. It's really like, in the Palestinian territories, for example, in Ramallah, there are, I think at the last count, 4 women serving in the Islamic court, dealing with the, standard everyday things like marriages and divorces and whatever. And in fact, it was very funny because the Rabbanut, the official Israeli rabbinate, was really unhappy about having women serving in positions of religious authority, even though they were not, imams, they weren't prayer leaders in that public kind of way, but they were still creating religious law. And Jewish women in Israel cannot do that because of the way that the religious authorities work there. It's just not possible. But in a lot of the Muslim majority countries where Islamic law is part of the larger system, there are very, very few places where what is called Sharia, but is actually much bigger than just Sharia. There's a whole series of terminology that has to do with law that comes out of the Islamic world. There are very few countries that are predominantly or only using Islamic law. Most of them are a combination of, actually Israel is a great example, where there's a civil system that governs things like property and, for the most part, education and how people buy and sell things and damages. And And then there's a religious system that deals with personal status issues and family law.
Can I interject? I thought of Sharia as the screaming right-wing politicians who say that Sharia law will become the law, that there are some cities in the United States which are already under Sharia law, that the Muslims want Sharia law to be the law of the land in the countries in Europe that they're emigrating to. The more I looked into it, the more I thought, wait a second, Sharia law feels and seems a lot like halakha to me. And because there are 1.6 billion Muslims, there are a lot of countries where the majority of the population is under this type of religious law. And there's only one country, which is a Jewish country, which is in Jerusalem under halakha. And if there are 1.6 billion, so is that right or wrong to understand Sharia as a type of halakha?
It's the best parallel that I think we could use. I mean, there's definitely ways. It's a system of religious law that can govern almost every part of life, theoretically, that offers wisdom on every part of life. Somebody who lives in Bnei Brak in Israel could say, I live every part of my life halachically and make all the decisions through a halachic system. Now, probably, like if they got in a car accident and were arrested for something, they would be going through a simple system. But there is stuff that halakha says about how damages work, and they could theoretically find answers in the halachic system.
A lot of trucks around here say H-A-L-A-L.
No.
So halal is kosher. Yes. Yes. So when you buy lunch from a park in New York City, 9 times out of 10 you're probably buying something that is halal, which means it's been overseen by Muslim authority in the same way that something that's kosher is overseen by Jewish authority. So every country, and this includes every Muslim majority country, first of all has different religious authorities interpreting things differently. And second of all, has different layers of how much is their civil authority, how much is religious authority interacting with that, overlapped with it, coming in only in certain places. Imagine for a minute if there were as many Jews in the world as there are Muslims, and imagine for a minute if we had, imagine for a minute if we had 38 Jewish majority countries, and now imagine the different neighborhoods in New York City that have large populations of Jews. If the Upper West Side was a Jewish majority country, the way that it interacted with halakha, with religious law, would be very different than the way that, say, Borough Park, if it were a country that was Jewish majority, would have an incredibly different relationship with how the law worked, which would have an effect on what was the role of women in society, which would have an effect on what is the role of, is there a role for LGBT people in society. So when we talk about Islam, it's like asking, well, Leviticus delineates that, you know, if you want to be in religious leadership, you cannot be disabled in multiple ways, that you cannot be a woman, that you cannot be descended from a line other than the priestly line. The way that that has been interpreted, and the way that that has shifted over the years, is right like night and day, and we understand that. And there are weird little pockets of Jews who are trying to bring back temple worship, and we're trying to resurrect a priestly class in Judaism, and they're very small, very weird group. And so, depending on which country you go to where there is a majority of Muslims, there are places that are incredibly modern, that have become the Upper West Side of the Muslim world, because of the ways that they interpret things. And then there are the fringe groups that say, well, all right, we're going to take the texts that are like those texts in Leviticus, and we're going to be as literal as possible, and really wield them as a weapon. And that's how most Muslims feel about them, in the same way that when I lived in Jerusalem, I felt about some of the impact of some of the more extreme.
Back to some of the questions about women.
Yes.
On the one hand, I can say that of the top 3 majority Muslim, the top 3 Muslim population countries, Indonesia, Pakistan, and India, 2 of them have had a woman as president or leader, correct? In Pakistan and in India.
Yeah.
Yes. But I will also say, to answer the question just straight out about women in worship, in Muslim worship, it is similar to, and you can correct me when I'm done, similar to Orthodox Judaism, that all of the mainstream congregations have men as imams, and an imam is interesting. It's like a rabbi in that an imam does not always lead the service. An imam is there. An imam is a teacher, a leader, and on Friday will give the sermon. The services are led by a man. I believe that there are some progressive groups where a woman can lead a service for women, but a woman would very rarely lead a mixed service. The fewer women go on Friday service. Friday is called Jum'ah. It is the one time during the week where the community is really urged to come together for prayer. Muslims who pray, devout Muslims will be praying 5 times a day, but their prayers are short. Their prayers are maybe 5 minutes, and they're done on their own. You've seen in public Muslims who have stopped, or in an office, have put out a prayer rug and done their prayers. The Jumu'ah prayers are predominantly male. I think that there's probably something like the Orthodox Jewish that women have other responsibilities in the house. Or
Actually, no. So
actually,
this is another way in which theoretically, Islam as a religion is more egalitarian. Not in that there are women leading prayer, but in that in Orthodox Judaism, it is obligatory for men to pray 3 times a day, and it is optional for women. In Islam, every single person, every single adult, is required to pray 5 times a day. Now, of course, it means human beings still being human beings, and cultures and cultural influence being cultural influence. The way that doesn't mean that means that there's going to be full egalitarianism either in an Orthodox synagogue or in a mosque. But the religion actually does treat women as more of full people. I feel it's terrible saying that. That feels terribly judgmental about traditional Judaism. But in the same way that in Orthodox Judaism, women cannot serve as witnesses. If you go to a wedding, as an Orthodox wedding, only men will be signing the ketubah because women are not considered stable enough. I don't know. It's not nice of me. But women are not considered to be people who can carry witness in a way that has legal power. In Islam, this is only slightly better, but it's better. Women's witness is considered to be half that of men's. So 2 women have the legal weight of 1 man. Whereas in Orthodox Judaism, women have no weight at all. So all of these have their problems, and all of these have their drawbacks, but they're actually, when we're talking about why there are women who are, look, in a lot of them, these Muslim majority countries, if you look at their parliaments, their congresses, whatever that parallel system of government is, there are often more women in those parliaments and those congresses than we have here in our Congress and House of Representatives. Because there's an understanding that women have to say there is a path to leadership that is inherently part of the religious tradition and inherently in the story of the religion's founder.
Marisa, let me go there and say, okay, we talked about women, let's talk about LGBT people. Let's talk about LGBT people in Islam and in Islam in the United States. Where are we? Are we 50 years ago in Judaism? Are we on the verge? When I look online, I went online for half an hour and I typed in LGBT Muslim service, LGBT Muslim leadership, and you get very little.
So if you think about services, I will say, look, I'm one of, it's still nice to be able to say this, I'm still one of the younger members of this congregation, right? And yet, when I started coming out, there was this sense of, can I still be part of my Jewish community? That was 20 years ago.
Right.
That's not that long ago. For people who came out 20 years, 40 years before I did, it was just like, there's no, what, religious community? How on earth? It's hard to say, I don't want to put, these frames of, well, they're 20 years behind us. Because I don't think the they and the us is actually that different. Because people who are young people coming out in the Orthodox world today, in the United States, in New York City and Manhattan, have a much, much, much harder time than somebody who is 4th generation African-American Muslim and lives with their partner in Harlem. That's still really hard, but it exists. And that's something that is in the community. Like I know people in Harlem who are like 2 women who are in a relationship, one of whom wears the hijab, one of whom doesn't. who go to pray regularly and who are fully part of their community. And I also have talked to young students at Yeshiva University who are terrified that they cannot come out because they will lose their, like, everything they have. So I'm hesitant to put that kind of like timeline on it.
Well, Marisa, are there also any texts the way Leviticus?
Absolutely.
So that,
Yes.
okay.
Yes. Homosexual, gay sex. It's just like Leviticus, right? That two men having sex that's the thing that's prohibited. And so of course they don't say put a fence around the Torah, but it's the same concept of forbidding things that are close to whatever that thing is in order to be more careful.
So on
I just want to make a mention.
Yeah.
I think it's really important to know that LGBT Muslims know there is an LGBT Muslim mosque, but one should not misinterpret that there isn't a lot of LGBT Muslim associations. There's an organization called Habibi. They get together, they have belly dancing, and they're really good belly dancers. There's a lot of...
It's actually a young man who
they know where to
it's
and they know how to find each other. So it's not like they're all in the closet and they're all like shaking in their boots.
Totally.
They're very much associated. It's just that they're not recognized. It's a difference.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
I think it depends on where, right, there is no Muslim CBST. There is no Muslim, well, no, there's no Muslim mosque. We are told when we go to NYU that Khalid Latif, the imam there, is certainly very progressive on LGBT issues. I have a friend who I met when I was doing some outreach work downtown, who went to Rutgers. He went to the University of Pennsylvania Law School. He's working for a large law firm. He is Muslim. He works in New Jersey. And I said to him, I said, let me ask you the question. I said, you certainly knew gay people in college. He said, oh, yes. He said, I bet you know gay Muslims. He said, oh, yes, one of my best friends is a gay Muslim. I said, how was life for him? He said, terrible. He said, and this is someone who very much lives in the secular world. He went to secular college, he went to law school, he works downtown. He said, you know, it's just hard for him. He said, my wife and I are very close friends, and he lives with, he lives with his mother, and he's expected to get married. He said, it's not easy, and we keep on looking. He said, and we're well connected. They're certainly better connected in the Muslim world than I am. He said, we keep on looking for places he could go, people he could talk to. He said, but it's very difficult. He said, even living in the New York metropolitan area, I think all these truths can exist simultaneously. You come out at the age of 8 in a Reform household in Westchester and everything's fine, or you can be a struggling 20-year-old in a Haredi household in Bronxville.
And I will say one thing about this is relevant. The religious leadership of the Muslim community in America, the majority did their studies abroad. Because up until very recently, there was no equivalent of a rabbinical school in America for Muslims who wanted to become imams. So a Muslim who wanted to become an imam, who lived in America, would go to Saudi Arabia, would go to Jordan, would go to Turkey, would, depending on, there's a couple of different schools used to be, would go to Damascus, different places, and then come back and lead communities. It's only in the last 15 years, 10 years, that there are now imams being, I don't think ordained is the right word, but
I think there's a track at the Union Theological Seminary.
among others,
But
yeah.
you're not going to
Yes,
learn
I do.
Quran there. You're going to learn Quran as a child.
But in the same way that like my rabbi grew up ultra-Orthodox in Borough Park and was ordained in Bnei Brak, and his entire rabbinical training was becoming expert in Talmud and becoming expert in systems of law. My rabbinical training included a whole lot of how do you be a pastoral person in a community, and how do you recognize all the different things that people go through in their lives and be prepared to be an open, warm, welcoming presence to help them through whatever difficulties they're going through without saying, oh, here's your problem and here's an answer in Leviticus. So the American-trained imams, and many of these schools are founded by imams who realized, some of them when doing interfaith work, that, oh, my Jewish and Christian colleagues have this training that I really wish I had. Let me help create something so that people can learn that here. So as that is shifting, it also means that religious communities, like I also have gay and lesbian Muslim friends in the US who basically have avoided religious community their entire lives, and so they have wonderful community, and people, they have excellent lives, but they're totally disconnected from the religious world. that, and Khalid Latif is one of the people who is really working very hard to change this, but that is something that is changing. And then I will also say, actually, that in also looking at like the Middle East and North Africa, I mean, every country is very different on LGBT issues, right? There's still like, I think it's 12 countries where, I don't want to say being gay, but gay sex is punished by the death penalty, officially. There are also countries where it is 100% legal. There are very few countries where I think there's only 1, 2, where there's actually protections in place. But that said, for example, there is one of the most popular pop groups right now in the Middle East from Beirut is called Mashru Leila, and their lead singer is openly gay. They have toured all over the Middle East, all over North Africa, into the Balkans. I mean, they've been in many, many, many places, and for the most part have just been intensely warmly welcomed. We saw them in New York last year, and the sweet thing is that when the lead singer at some point asked, and I think he was joking, "So how many of you are from Beirut?" About half the room erupted in cheers. So there was really like a Lebanese diaspora that came together and were just like thrilled with this very openly gay guy from Beirut who's singing on stage. So there's more complexity than most people imagine.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
While we're talking about
Yes.
LGBT and Islam, you know, it's Persian and Sufism, but Rumi was really, you know, his relationship with Shams is really celebrated, sort of, or not celebrated, but recognized as a gay community.
I think you have the same thing where before there was a Western influence, there was certainly homoerotic poetry, there was recognition of not necessarily binary genders, and then the Victorians who went all over the world saying, no, 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 this is nasty, sort of turned people against that. I think that it's the same thing in medieval, you know, in early medieval Jewish poetry and thought. There's a certain identification that there's more than just love between men and women. I'm going to ask you one last question.
And I'll also just add that anytime you're at a museum with an Islamic art section, you can see that reflected in so much of the art. I mean, it's relatively rare to see images of human beings in Islamic art, but that's something that's kind of not smiled upon. It's forbidden to make an image of the prophet or God or anything, whatever, but there are sometimes pictures of people, and there are often like illustrating love scenes, clearly love scenes between two men. So that's, yes,
So,
there is that tradition also.
I would leave everyone, I'm going to have one last question, but before that, I would leave everyone who's going to the mosque with the idea that as you look at the people who are coming and going, it's likely that 2/3 of them were not born in the United States. And that as you pointed out, they came from countries which are not necessarily in what I might call the developed world, where attitudes towards empowerment of women and attitudes towards LGBT people are different. And it may not be so much as it's a Muslim thing as it's the country you came from. So take a look, and as you're working in the mosque, ask people. You know, they have been very eager to talk to us. Where are you from? Were you born in the United States? Where are your parents from? What is life like for you here, etc., etc. And the last question I have never been to Israel. I will go on our next CBST trip. But you're doing...
His apartment's for next week.
Yeah, well, my invitation must have gone astray. You have done work now, Jewish-Muslim work in the United States, and Jewish-Muslim work in Israel. Compare and contrast the relations between the two communities here and there.
Oh my gosh. I mean, well, look, so first of all, it's so interestingly, Israeli Jews have more diversity than Palestinian Muslims, right? It's the flip of what it is here. Because here, American Jews are relatively, not entirely, really not entirely, but relatively homogenous. We tend to be very Ashkenazi dominated.
White.
And very white for the most part. And our communities, right, when we look around, it's most of us look like we could be related to each other in one way or another. And if not, I still wish we were. And if you look around at the mosque and you see who's arriving, I mean, it's a little bit like the United Nations. It's incredible. Here.
Right.
When I was taking these classes and doing this stuff when I was in Israel, I mean, you know, Palestinian citizens of Israel, first of all, a number of whom are Christian, but the Muslims who are there are, they're from there. It's not that there's like huge amounts of Muslim immigration. It doesn't really happen. So it's a different dynamic in that way. Compare and contrast. Palestinian Muslims actually tend to be pretty secular. I think as the world is changing and as things are less certain for everybody in the world, more people of all religions are kind of clinging to their religions a little more. More people become religious in times of trouble, right? That's just like a thing that happens. And especially if you're part of a minority community that feels under attack, right? I hear about swastikas at a synagogue, and I want to like put my kippah on my head and walk outside and like wave it in every single person's face. That is an instinct that every single human being has to like stand up for, represent, defend, love their community more, the more there's an outside feeling of attack. So there's a way in which Palestinian Muslims actually are a relatively secular bunch, but there's also the way in which that as life becomes harder, there's a drift towards more religiousness. There's not a whole lot of comparing and contrasting I can really do about that. I'll just say that it's everywhere I've been, and also there, being Jewish was actually being the majority person, which has its own discomfort. Suddenly being the person with the privilege, and suddenly being the person for whose safety's sake somebody else is being denied something is a very uncomfortable place to be in. And as somebody who grew up in America as a Jew, I had never really consciously noticed that in the same way that I did when I was living in Israel. But really, I mean, just the main thing that has characterized my learning and my relationships with Muslims around the world, I mean, I've really now met people from so many different places, is like the warmth of recognition of the things that we share, and that's the thing that I've just kind of learned to always approach with an open curiosity, because that's the thing that's rewarded the most.
Wow. This was, it was fascinating for us. We hope it was interesting for you too. We do have a planning meeting on Monday, and I'd like to ask a question. There are a couple of ideas. This is the second of 6 of these sessions. There's some ideas that are bubbling around the other ones. And just give me a show of enthusiasm for. I'll give you all the ideas so that you know what you're voting on. One of them is bringing in a number of people from NYU, so that we can have smaller groups, and it can be, 2 of us and 1 of them doing text study. That's something. So we do Jewish text study and Islamic text study, and you're doing it with someone from the other tradition. Another would be a meeting like that, but it's not necessarily text study. It's really talking about your life and just a conversation with someone, because I know that I had never had a conversation with someone who was Muslim about being Muslim. Another one is to bring in 1 or more leaders from the LGBT Muslim community to talk to us from the inside, what that is like. Another one is to bring someone from the Muslim Bar Association to give us the inside story on what the Muslim ban looks like and what living as a Muslim in the United States is like right now. And then we would also be open to some other ideas that we could do. So the Jewish Muslim small group text study, who thinks that would be an interesting thing to do? Okay. The Jewish Muslim conversation, which is not necessarily a text study.
Speed dating.
Okay. An LGBT Muslim leader to talk to us about the position. Okay. And someone from the Muslim Bar Association to talk to us about the legal issues. So I'm seeing enthusiasm for all of these. Is there anything that I am missing where there's an idea? Go ahead.
I'm going to be a little daring. One thing that's, you started with that in the beginning, last one. I think one of the things should be actually some mutual care.
That is not daring. That's a great idea.
What?
Okay.
Joint prayer.
The idea, if I could, because it's hard.
Let me finish
Oh,
that.
sorry, go ahead.
Okay. So the idea is that I think the intellectual concepts are really important, but in order for our heart to be in the right place, we should try to actually experience some Muslim prayer. And a lot of what they do is called zikr, which is zakar. It's the same roots in Hebrew, right?
That's the dot.
the idea is that a lot of times what they'll do is they'll chant Allah or something like that, which is not Elohim, Allah, you know. So I think if we had a Muslim leader, I think it would be, or someone to lead a prayer and have some kind of communal experience. I think that would touch us.
That is wonderful. I wouldn't call that daring. Who would be interested in really rolling up your sleeves and doing some Muslim prayer so that we experience some mixture of the two, something that really is spiritual. It's not a lecture, it's a hands-on experience. All right, great idea. We are now at, yes, I'm sorry.
It could also be interesting to do something where we're looking at the texts that speak the same ancestors from the two different
The story of Moses, Abraham, and Abraham. Okay, that is a great idea.
Feminist, Islamic feminist.
Islamic feminist.
They're wicked.
Maybe something with like a shared communal meal with maybe like some traditional Jewish foods, some traditional other what?
Cooking together.
We have a kitchen downstairs.
I think eating together is a really
yes. We actually thought of doing a Seder together, but with everything going on, it was
I don't
just
think it should
a
be
little too much to do. But you're
but
saying
it shouldn't be a
Seder.
Jewish thing. It should be
we cook.
uneven keel.
We invite Muslim friends here. We invite Muslims and we cook together and we eat together. Is that?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know about the cooking, but
We eat together.
whatever.
At least we
Bring
eat together.
food. Bring
Foods
food.
are both traditions.
A potluck.
Yes.
I wonder, do we have any plans to move on from NYU? I mean, they're great, and I
Yes.
love it. Like, but to go to a
Yes.
more adult mosque and stuff and really...
Yes, we do. We're discussing that on Monday. There are a number of places, even in Manhattan, we can go. People have said to us, I am on the Upper West Side, I could go to someplace for an hour on the Upper West Side, I just can't get to NYU, or we've gone to NYU every week, there are other places to go to. That's an idea that we're bringing to the meeting. Yes?
So there's a thing next Thursday. There's a Muslim-run Jewish deli in Brooklyn. And there's an event there for Jews and Muslims to get together and eat pastrami.
Really?
If you tell me who you are.
Oh, those are my people.
Yeah.
Oh, Larry will tell you about that. Okay, any other questions, ideas, wrap up?
Not just follow Mark.
There he is.
Are we welcome at every mosque? If we go and identify gay Jews holding our signs.
That's what we want to
Larry, it's an interesting question, one that we're trying to get answered by our Muslim advisors. We're certainly welcome, as far as I've seen, we're welcome as Jews, any place we want to go. We have not been in your face or as visual.
Our signs say Jews welcome Muslims. They don't say.
You're welcome as a Jew, whether you're welcome as a gay Jew. It's a complicated issue which we're trying to address. We want to go past it in NYU. We don't want to put anyone in a position where they feel uncomfortable. So that's where we are. Other ideas?
All right, so I'm going to pull us together because we need to end, but I want to end with one cool thing that I learned that is just something that I love. For those of you who have ever done like embodied Jewish whatever, and you know the name of God, the letters Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, that if you look at the human body, you can say Yud, the arms of a Hey, here's the Vav, and then your legs of a Hey. Right? I've had this as a teaching before, that this is like God is in your body and God's everyone. So the Arabic word for God, Allah, is if you do this with your hand. Aleph, Lam, Aleph, Hey. I get the letters wrong, but that's okay. But so when you do this with your hands, it spells Allah. And so somebody told me this is how you know that God is just in all of our hands. So I love that both traditions also have like this desire to find where is that divine in all of us and to really see it in every human person. All right.
Thank you very much.